What are the odds? By Mike Lindell. Published 2019. Digital Hawk holds and owns no copyrights to the reading of this material for educational purposes only. Chapter 14. Tunica. Card counting started to keep me away from home and from Schmitty's for longer periods. I was trying to earn a living to support my family, but my increasing absences also placed a greater burden on Karen, who stayed home and wrangled teenagers. After I went bust and lost my truck topper in Kansas City, I found myself in a similar neighborhood in Memphis, Tennessee. Too low on cash to fund another card counting trip, I had asked one of my crack buddies, Gary, to go to a casino with me for a week. Our arrangement was that he would provide the cash and I would do the counting. Between gambling tables at Tunica Resorts, a cluster of casinos in northwest Mississippi, just over the state line from Memphis, we would get high. Gary and I arrived in Memphis around 11 p.m. We needed to accomplish two things: get directions to Tunica and get crack before we got there. Gary and I checked off the second item on our list, buying some crack in a neighborhood of sagging two-decker houses. It was a very bad area. The streets rippled with dark moving shadows that had eyes that lit up when our headlights moved past. We smoked the crack, but it turned out to be as bad as the neighborhood. Now it was 3 a.m., and we needed more. The neighborhood was a mile-long street shaped like the letter U. At the top of the street, clear of what seemed to be the most dangerous area, there was a liquor store. Across from the street was a median strip, and when Gary drove by, I spotted a young black man sitting on a mound of dirt. He looked to be in his mid 20s. Stop here, I told Gary. Let's ask him. Gary pulled over so that the young man was on the passenger side of the car. Do you know where I can get some crack? I asked him. Yeah, he said. He jumped in the car and pointed back toward the neighborhood we'd just left. But I'm not going in there alone. What's your name? I asked him, and as we rolled back toward the shadows, Tony. Tony, a good looking kid, was casually dressed. He didn't look like someone down on his luck. In other words, someone who would be sitting on a median strip at 3 a.m. What were you doing back there, sitting in the middle of the road? What were you doing back there, sitting in the middle of the road? I asked him. Tony started telling us his story. He was from Kentucky and had come to Memphis to visit his uncle, who owned stores and a chicken restaurant franchise. It was supposed to be just for one weekend, but Tony had spent all his money on crack and couldn't get home. He'd been stuck in Memphis for 2 weeks. There was a warrant for his arrest back home, and he needed to get it cleared, but he didn't have any money. Then he said something that broke my heart. I have a fiance back home. She goes to church and doesn't drink or do drugs or anything. Tony had blown it with her before over crack, and she had given him a second chance. He added, almost crying, I told her I'd never do this again. As Tony talked, Gary steered the car through the dark. We could see people sitting on the balconies and lower porches of the two deckers, even though it was the middle of the night. I felt for Tony. I felt for Tony. I knew what it was like to disappoint the people I loved. I asked him where he was staying, and he said he didn't have any place to go. I told him we were professional gamblers on our way to Tunica. Why don't you come stay with us? I said. Gratefully, Tony agreed. In front of one of the houses, he told Gary to stop. He disappeared inside, then returned. I couldn't tell whether he'd gotten us some crack, but He did come back with a very scary passenger, a white guy with hard eyes who stared at me and said, "I want everything you've got." The guy didn't seem to have a gun, but he twitched and rambled and mumbled, reminding me of one of the harder cases at Wilmar. I tried to coax him into getting out of the car. Deflecting his odd and slightly menacing remarks, I explained that we were in town to gamble in Tunica. I didn't mention that Gary and me, we had about $10,000. Between Gary and me, we had about $10,000. Can we drop you somewhere? I said. No, he said. I'm not going anywhere. What was I going to do? Call the cops and say, "Hey, I was buying crack and now I've got some nut job in my car. Can you help?" Once again, my addictions had placed me in a situation where I was at the mercy of bad people. It was a lesson I seemed to learn over and over. I seemed to have to learn over and over. Eventually, I convinced the nut job that we didn't have anything that would interest him. After a few blocks, he told us to pull over and let him out. Relieved, we drove south across the state line. 20 miles later, we rolled into Tunica, Mississippi, a town that Reverend Jesse Jackson in 1985 called America's Ethiopia. Until the 1990s, Tunica felt like the old rural South, surrounded by rice, cotton, and soybean. It was so poverty stricken that people in one neighborhood called Sugar Ditch Alley lived among open sewers. Now, though, Tunica had become the fifth largest gaming city in America, and the neon lights of 9 casinos glowed against the night sky. Gary found our casino hotel. When we checked in, we got caught up in smoking crack and never made it to the casino floor. Night became day and day became night again. Between hits on the pipe, Tony and I talked about crack and the hold it had on us, about how it tears apart relationships and sucks away everything you love. Tony told me about his family, especially his fiancee. He felt terrible that he let her down. Tears filled his eyes, and I could see in him that battle between addiction and conscience that affects so many of us. Your actions betray your heart. You want to quit and try to quit, but a great unseen well of pain, as well as physical, chemical dependency, drags you back down. Pretty soon, you've tried and failed to get clean so many times that nobody, including you, believes you anymore. I told him about my life, about all the strange coincidences and near misses. I look at my life and think, what are the odds of all these things happening to one person? I said. So many crazy things happened to me that I'd been telling people I was going to write a book. More and more, I told Tony I wondered if God was trying to get my attention. We stayed at the casino hotel for 4 days. 3 times we all piled into the car and drove back to Memphis to find more drugs. The third time, trouble found us. Gary was driving and I was in the passenger seat. Tony sat in back holding $300 I had given him to get more crack. At about 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning, we were about a block into the same rundown U shaped neighborhood when Gary said, "There's a cop behind us." I glanced back and saw that he was right. We hadn't seen a hint of law enforcement in this neighborhood at night. But now, a black and white was following us. We passed a couple more two-decker homes before Tony tapped on Gary's shoulder. "Hey, pull up here." "Honk the horn and let me out." Gary pulled to the curb and the cop slowed to a crawl. Gary tapped the horn twice. My nerves tingled and I took a deep breath. I expected to hear the whoop whoop of the patrol car pulling us over and maybe a cop's voice through a loudspeaker. "Step out of the car." Tony got out of the back seat and walked up to a house, a different house than the one he'd led us to before. The cops accelerated and drove on past. I finally exhaled. Gary and I sat in the car and watched the patrol car roll down the street and disappear around the U-turn. Tony returned and jumped in the back seat, slamming the door. What was that all about?" Gary said. Tony grinned. "I wanted them to think we were just picking somebody up." We waited. Then, through the spaces between houses, we could see the black and white head back out of the neighborhood along the road on the other side. When the cops were gone, Gary steered on to our actual destination and pulled over again. "Drop me off here," Tony said. I'll go get the stuff. You guys get out of this neighborhood. Wait for me at that little store. Back at the liquor store across the street from where we'd first met Tony, the sun beat down on cracked asphalt and broken down signage. The shop was closed and the surrounding block was deserted. The whole place looked even scarier during the day. Gary gave me a skeptical look. You know, Tony's got $300 of your money, right? You know, Tony's got $300 of your money, right? I had complete faith in Tony. He'll be back, I said. My words were still hanging in the air when the patrol car reappeared, red and blue flash lights flashing. It pulled into the parking lot and skidded to a stop behind us. Two cops jumped out, one black, one white. The black cop was at least 6'4". He walked to my side of the car, bent at the waist, and looked in. Step out of the vehicle, he said. The white cop had gone over to Gary's side. The second one got out of the car. The cop saw a wad of money sticking out of my shirt pocket and a pen sticking out of the other. I think the pen must have looked like a crack pipe because he turned me around and slammed my head against the car. Gary got the same treatment. What are you doing? I yelled. Where did you get that money? Between us, the cops found about $8,000. We're professional gamblers, I said. We're on our way down to Tunica. The black cop gave me a look that said, Who are you kidding? He asked to see my ID. Gary showed the white cop his. Neither officer was satisfied. The cash, the suspicious pen, and the fact they'd just seen us, a couple of white guys rolling through one of the worst neighborhoods in the United States, it all added up to probable cause. The officer stashed us in the back of the squad car and went back to search our rental. I started to sweat. I knew they would find a pipe because I'd thrown mine out back in the neighborhood after the cops drove by. But there was other evidence, baking soda and a spoon with crack residue and burn marks on the bottom. Besides me, Gary sat with a dazed look on on his face. We both knew we were probably going to jail. Tony was long gone, though. Lucky him. My mind raced. How bad is it going to be? Can they get us on that spoon residue? After several minutes, the black officer came back carrying the baking soda and the burn spoon. What's this? He said, holding out the baking soda with a straight face. I said, I've got really bad feet. I use it for foot powder. His expression said he knew better. He was about to ask about the burnt spoon when Tony came out from around the nearby building. He walked up and started talking to the police. I couldn't hear what he was saying from inside the squad car, but he was talking to them like friends, like he knew them. He set us up, I thought. Wasn't this where we'd met him in the first place? Gary and I waited anxiously. Finally, the cops came over and let Gary and me out of their car. I'm going to tell you something, the black cop said. People die in there. You go back to wherever you came from. Go to Tunica, whatever. But don't ever come to this part of town again. Do we have an understanding? So can we go? I said, astonished. He nodded. He didn't have to tell me twice. We jumped in the car and drove away. Before the cops could change their minds, as soon as we were on the road, I asked Tony what happened back there. As he was walking out of the neighborhood, he saw the squad car, he said. Suspicious, he sent two little kids to see if there were a couple of white dudes in the cop car. They came back and told me yes. So I had to make a decision. I could either let them take you in or do something to try to save you. What did you tell the cops? I told them you were just gamblers. I told them you wanted some drugs, but that they showed up before the deal went down, Tony said. I said you were harmless and that we were going back to Tunica. They didn't check your ID? No, they didn't. I was still confused. Tony could have walked away with my $300. He could have been arrested himself because of his outstanding warrant. Why'd you decide to talk to the cops? I asked. I don't know, man. Something just told me I had to get you out. That was one of those moments when my life could have taken a whole different path. I'd been arrested for DUI, but never drug possession. In the back of that police car, I was sure I was going down, that I was going to shame my family once again and lose my business. Then suddenly I was free to go. But the blessing of my narrow escape did not produce wisdom. Did you get the crack? I asked Tony. Did you get the crack? He said. He'd hidden it in behind the store, and like fools, we went back to get it. Afterwards, as we drove toward Tunica, my near miss with the cops and all the relief I'd felt at not ruining my life vanished. All I could think about was that first hit of crack. Nothing else. The drive seemed to take forever. Once we were back in the hotel room, Gary fell asleep and Tony and I got deeper and deeper into conversation. The next morning, Gary still had his cash, but I'd spent almost all of mine on crack. I'd come to Tunica to earn money counting cards, but I hadn't played a single hand of blackjack. I had a few $100s left and considered how to spend it. I decided I would wake up Gary to get cash for card counting. I would give Tony the rest of my money to get us more drugs and beer. I had begun to carry out this plan when I looked into Tony's eyes and saw a deep sadness. I knew exactly what he was feeling because I'd felt it myself. Searing regret, a remorse that yawns like a hole in your soul, wondering how you got so low and whether you'll ever be able to climb up again. I held out my hand and offered him all my cash, maybe 300 or 400. You know what? I said. You take this money and go home. Don't look back. Tony burst into tears on the spot. He called his fiancee, confessed what he'd been doing, and begged her for another chance. She gave it to him. Thank you, Tony said as he hugged me. I saw a new glint of determination in his eyes. He turned and walked out of the hotel room, and I never saw him again. Years later, though, under very strange circumstances, I would learn exactly what happened to him.